I'm going to start by doing something I spoke at the Luncheon yesterday, and I wanted to start by mentioning that this book is available here today on Salem Templates, where people have a table full of books. I failed to mention that yesterday. I got to the end and thought, you know, I kind of want to know about the book. I forgot. So, give me 1 second to rebuild the little laptop here. Always helps if you put your glasses on. All right. So the book is called A Different War, and I'd like to start with a map of Ukraine. Some of you may know when Mario mentioned that I dedicate about a month a year to different humanitarian causes. That has led me to a number of places around the world that a lot of people would prefer not. Where I was there in 2009 documenting that, and also a number of times in Ethiopia, Colombia, Nicaragua, different places. And usually when I go, my focus is on, not so much on the conflict, but rather on the people who are marginalized by the conflict. And so in 2022, I was invited on a fact-finding mission to Ukraine. It was October of that year, and I said, sure, I'll come along, but just don't expect a book or a film. And my host said, that's fine, just come and see what's happening. And the first trip, I put up the map here so you can see it, but in the left-hand side there you see Hungary. And we started in Budapest. We were 8 guys in a van with a drop. The first center that we went to was featuring, showing us what they were doing with art therapy. So these 2 illustrations were done by kids. And as I mentioned, I really came in with no agenda except to document and listen and see what was going on. And at the end of our trip, after going into Ukraine, we went down into Moldova, and they were also housing at the time over 80,000 refugees there. But the refugee situation, to give you a sense of it, was almost everywhere we went was women and children. Occasionally you'd see, if you saw men, they tended to be older men who were infirm in some way, or young boys. But the women and children were comprised of about 7 million refugees. An almost equal number of Ukrainians were IDPs at the time, and I'll get into that in a minute. But the refugees, in large part, had at least some ability to move beyond the borders of Ukraine. And in UN speak, that the term if you were still in Sudan, you would be called internally displaced or an IDP. But of the roughly 7 million or so, we had a chance to just document pockets of them here and there. When I got to Moldova, I went to the most interesting refugee center. It's like a retail space, kind of like a single building in a strip mall. And when you walked inside it, it was roughly maybe 1/5 the size of this room. And it was filled floor to ceiling with bunk beds. And this was one of the young people that I talked to there. I found her disinterest in me and in our entourage to be quite captivating. So I walked over and specifically singled her out and said, "Can I talk with you?" She removed her headsets and said, "Sure." And I said, "I'd like to take your picture." And she said, in perfect English, she said, "Well, what are you going to do with it?" Which is always the question everyone should ask. And I said, "What would you like me not to do with it?" And she said, "Please don't put it on social media." I said, "Okay, is there anything else?" No, that was it. So I said, "Well, what I will do is use it in talks to Rotary clubs and groups like this." And I said, "And it may wind up in a book, but I promise I will not put your picture on social media." And then she went back to her phone and did her thing and let me photograph her. When I got home after that and I was going through all my photos, I came across this one. And as Mario mentioned, kindly, my background from UW-Madison was poetry, and I had just finished a poetry book, and I thought, you know what? This girl deserves a poem. So I'm going to read you 2 poems today, but this is a longer poem. And it's called The Top Bunk, because that's where I photographed her. She was seated in the top bunk. And she was there with her mother and her little sister, who never spoke the whole time we were there, and I found out that she hadn't spoken since they had left Ukraine. So the first poem I'll read you is about this girl, and it's called The Top Bunk. The top bunk. Headphones, hair tie, enough makeup for a few days. Your delicate hands tap a cell phone in a fancy blue case. A blue that does not exist in nature. A blue you picked before the war, excited, smiling, the day the new phone came in a cardboard box from Amazon. Now, 8 months later, you are alone in a top bunk, tucked in a corner of a warehouse for humans who have walked here from Kharkiv, humans who have crossed a border bridge with nothing but a pack, a suitcase rattling on broken wheels, a bicycle with a flat, and a cat on a leash for the first time in his life. A cat who has not had a meal in days. A pillar of cement shadows your face from a world you do not know, but you have decided you are going nowhere else because this is far enough. Far enough from broken bricks and splintered boards shattered, your bedroom window blasted by bombs into tiny pieces, seeds for the garden of destruction. Because this is far enough. A warehouse in Chechnya, with 40 beds, a sink, a hot plate, and Wi-Fi. You were in a top bunk and going nowhere because this is far enough. The color of your hair matches your sweatshirt, your nails, and the lipstick you have applied with care. The color of your hair matches the dried blood of fathers in mass graves in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, the graves with uncle and brother whose beaten face betrayed no secrets. You have not come alone because God gave you a little sister, yes, that God, the same one who the priest says loves Putin as much as you. And she, Tanya, would never stop talking until the noise of sirens, the smell of burning flesh, the unbreathable air, and the rumble of falling floors, sinking ceilings, crumbled shelters, and broken roads squeezed her voice deeper and deeper inside until she could not speak. Not to you, not to Mom, and not to grandfather who has issues of his own, not to the man in the moon who listened like no one else. For Tanya, there is only paper, crayons, pencils, markers. She draws bent lines, houses without walls, skies filled with circles of smoke, and dead trees without leaves, the color of your hair. You were in a top bunk and going nowhere because this is far enough. It's a hard poem to read because there's about 20 poems in the book, and almost all of them are from the first person perspective of people that I've met while I've been in Ukraine now 3 times. This is the outcome of that first fact-finding trip, is this book. Once I finished that poem and started talking about the war with various people, a number of people said, more poetry, more poetry, more poetry. So the book started with about 20 poems and then worked into adding all of the prose that helps to explain the history, especially the most recent history, and gets you really into what really happened in late February of 2022 and what's still happening today. So when you talk about refugees, the question is, who are the refugees? The first answer is everything has been destroyed and lost in an instant. So almost all the refugees are from, in this case, from the eastern part of Ukraine, and almost all of them had their homes destroyed, had their cars destroyed. Everything that they would have had in their possession or people that were in their lives that helped them define what home means has been taken away from them. And as I mentioned, if they had the resources, in many cases, they crossed the border. These are 4 kids that I photographed at a refugee camp in Moldova who are, in this case, they are literally in a summer camp. It was a 3-season summer camp, and they were being allowed to stay there. This is a picture of the bunkhouse at the retail center that I described. The outside and the inside. And these are just a few photos of the refugees. I mentioned the cat on a leash who had crossed, and this is the cat that inspired that line. And this is a mother and a child, and I stayed in touch with this particular mother and child, and afterwards helped them arrange some online schooling for the girl after we got back. And these two I put here today because the woman on the right-hand side, this is a mother-daughter from Eastern Ukraine, and the woman on the right-hand side, when we met her and sat in her little bunkhouse area and asked how her life was going, couldn't have been a nicer person and very kind, but she wanted me to know that she had breast cancer and she had left Ukraine about 2 months earlier and had not been able to get any chemo treatment since she had left Ukraine. That's just one example of how your life could be interrupted. So I mentioned internally displaced people before. IDPs are what most people call them, and that happens to be the people who have been displaced by the war, but for whatever reasons are not leaving the borders. They maybe have relatives within Ukraine, or a business opportunity in another city, or something keeps them within the confines of Ukraine. And one of the cities in Ukraine that we've visited a number of times, I know my friend Doug Davis, who's here, has been there many times, and this Rotary has worked extensively with a group in Lviv, in western Ukraine, which you can see on the map, just to give you a sense of what it means to be an IDP. Over hundreds of thousands of people have migrated from eastern Ukraine to western Ukraine, and the city of Lviv has increased in size over 600,000 people since the start of the war. So that'd be like Madison size to Milwaukee size, just since the war started. So you can imagine the impact on the supply chain, gas, food, housing. It's a safer city in many respects, but now it has all kinds of social issues that it did not have before. These are 3 women that I photographed that are IDPs, and all their husbands are either dead or fighting, and you can see in the background of the shot on the left what looks like little trailers, and that's where they're living. There's a kitchen in every trailer, community kitchen, and then bunks. This is 2 people I've gotten to know quite well. Arthur on the left and Liza, the young girl on the right. Arthur was disabled before the war began. Both of these 2 people, Liza and Arthur, both lived in the city of Bakhmut, which is largely destroyed and leveled at this point, really doesn't exist anymore. But Arthur was in a wheelchair since he was 18 and had an incredible life. He was a ping pong champion, a wheelchair marathon expert. He had a coin collection, he had a dog, he had a wheelchair accessible van that he drove himself. All of those things disappeared in one night when his house was bombed. He managed, when he heard the sirens, he couldn't get to his wheelchair, and he managed to get to his basement. And they found him in his basement with his wheelchair upstairs destroyed. The rest of the house was destroyed. When I met him at a rehabilitation center in the city of Venezia. And he was as affable and kind as could be. He lives there now with his mother. They share a little tiny dorm room. And I've seen him on 3 separate visits. The most recent time I took him a bunch of coins so he could restart his coin collection. But he's an extraordinary person, and you wouldn't believe it, but he's still trying to do wheelchair marathons even in the midst of the war. And so quite a captivating figure. Liza on the right was 3 years old when her house was destroyed. She now lives in an orphanage in the city of Lviv. I've been in contact with her as recently as last week, and I feature her in the book. And also, it appears that the resources are in place that we're actually going to be doing a short film about Liza and uniting her with the head of the Paralympic Center in Ukraine as well. And trying to, it's a longer story than I can tell here today, but the head of the Paralympic Center is without the use of his legs since he was about the same age, and he went on to become an Olympic champion swimmer. And we're trying to set it up so that he teaches her how to swim. And hopefully that'll be the first film that comes out of these journeys. But Liza turns out to be, I probably have 40 or 50 videos of her from a physical therapist. And it turns out that she is quite possibly the most inspiring person I've ever seen. I've photographed her doing physical therapy, and every time she's happy and laughing that inspiring? So I did want to include a little bit about war crimes. You've probably heard that there are a lot of war crimes that have taken place within Ukraine. I've read about many of them. I've only photographed the one particular war crime, which is it was in a community north of the city of Kyiv. When the Russians first came across the border from Belarus and they were coming down towards Kyiv, a number of Russian soldiers and several tanks came into a village called Yehidny. Yehidny is not even on the map, it's so small. At the time of the Russian invasion, there were a ballpark of about 370 people living there. And the Russians took up the space around the little primary school. There was no gas station, no general store. It really was literally not on a map for anyone, but they decided to put their resources there, and they captured all of the villagers and put them in the basement of the school. So on my second visit, I went there and documented it, and to their credit, no one had touched anything in that school since the Russians had been forced out by Ukrainian forces. But they lived in the basement for 28 days, and during that time, the water that they drank by testimonial was putrid water, very little food, and 10 people died in captivity during that period. And the photos, I do have several photos of that village and of that school in the book. But that's one of many war crimes that are being investigated right now by the International Criminal Court. There's several stories about it that if the Time Magazine did a story, Sky News did a story, so you're welcome to look those up on your own and get a better sense of what happened. On a nationwide level, one of the more interesting things that happens in crisis zones is that you never know what's going to happen to kids who have no guardian, or whose guardians or parents have been killed, or for any number of reasons are not there. And so in every place I've been, whether it's Haiti after the earthquake or Sudan, the first thing you want to pay attention to is the security of the children in those locations. We do know that over 200,000 children have been taken by Russian forces in the eastern zone, and only 20,000 of those kids, as of August, have been reunited with their families in Ukraine. So imagine a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, parents are killed in a bombing or a missile attack and gone, and now what do you do with the kids? In terms of casualties, some academic, a lot smarter than me, may have a good number on what the casualties are. We know that the casualties on both sides are in hundreds of thousands, and no one seems to be able to provide any clear estimate on what the casualties are. In Russia, virtually no civilian casualties, almost entirely soldiers that have crossed into Ukraine. On the Ukrainian side, it's a significant number of civilian casualties and military casualties. We do know that there's at least 30,000 documented amputations of people in Ukraine. If you talk to someone from one of the major hospitals in Lviv in western Ukraine, you'll get estimates that are 2 or 3 times that number. That is a significant number of people who've had an amputation of an arm or a leg or both. One of the more interesting and compelling stories that I've documented but did not include in the book is that most of the prosthetics in Ukraine are now being either developed and implemented right on location in Ukraine. So I actually went into a lab of one of the hospitals and they were 3D printing the prosthetics right there in the hospital. Initially with a lot of support from the US and engineers here, but now more and more just doing it on their own. So in terms of advances in any particular kind of medical technology, you'll see advances in prosthetics and advances in tourniquets. But I'll leave that to Dr. Doug or others to talk about. So the photo that you do see here, I tell the story in the book. The man in the background is a 53-year-old soldier named Alexei. In the foreground is his wife, Julia. Alexei volunteered to serve because his son had enlisted in the military about a year before the war began. And so when his son was fighting, he decided, well, if my son can fight, I can fight too. So he enlisted. He was a tailor before the war. And his wife, before the war, worked in selling solar panels in the area that they lived in. And when I photographed him, I was in one of the military hospitals. And they're always very careful not to be able to photograph the faces of the patients and the soldiers within the hospital. So there were 4 guys in a little tiny hospital room, all with amputations, and his wife, Julie, was there, and I asked her if I could photograph him from here down, and so they said, sure. And this is the photo that resulted from that visit. I've since photographed them and met them and talked with them fairly regularly over email or occasionally WhatsApp. And their stories featured in the book. The one thing that I will mention, won't destroy the reading of the book, but when he lost his right arm, one of the other things that went with it was his wedding ring. And his wife made it to the field hospital within 24 hours. He was there. Of course, all the focus was on the arm, and when he woke up and came to, was talking with her, his biggest thing was, I lost my wedding ring, I lost my wedding ring. So the soldiers that he was with who had survived went back to that location 2 days later, and they found his wedding ring. And so he now wears it on his left arm. So back to the map, a final time here. If you look at the Polish border, almost as far south as you can go, about 1 mile from that border is the Paralympic Center that's training Paralympic champions who just competed recently in Paris in the Special Olympics there. And the site of that center now is as a result of the original invasion in 2014 in Crimea. So the original Paralympic site was in Crimea. When the Russians took that in 2014, it was built. They built a new one in the mountains, the Carpathian Mountains in that region around the Polish border. And I mentioned Valery, the gentleman that runs it. He's the inspiration behind the Paralympic Center. And I was there for 2 days, and I managed to photograph a number of the soldiers who were there that were struggling with their own issues, whether it was burns or blindness or amputations. And all of that was quite interesting. But also while I was there was a school group there, because it's kind of like a dormitory type environment with a big kitchen where everybody eats together. And the student group that was there were from the city of Kherson, and it was like a spring break kind of week. So you'll find that a lot of the kids in the schools in the east in the major cities are actually, their classrooms have been moved down into subways or into basements. And so in her case, the school was in a subway. So imagine you're there for weeks on end learning basic primary school subjects, and now you get a week off, what are you going to do? And the school had hired a bus and took about 35 students all the way across the country to the Paralympic Center just to give the kids a break. And the girl that you see here, her name is Larissa. And I did correspond with Larissa 3 or 4 emails after I met her here. We have since lost contact. She stopped responding to emails, and I don't know in this case what that means. But when I met her, it was Halloween Day last year. And so her ears, she was the only kid that was dressed up at all. I knew it was Halloween, but nobody else was dressed up. But I walked over to her and I said, nice ears. And she responded in perfect English. She was fluent in 3 languages, including English was one of them. And it turned out that she was a big fan of Harry Potter and a big fan of Tolkien and Lewis and the different fantasy writers. And that's what inspired our conversation. But I found her quite captivating. So I'm going to end the first part of this presentation with a poem that she inspired. And this is a poem, a much shorter poem. But this is a poem she inspired called Magical Things. Maybe there are monsters in the woods near Kherson. Maybe they have long guns with deadly bullets and mechanical birds with bombs. Maybe they have missiles that can flatten schools and rockets built to turn hospitals and houses into dust. I do know this. Monsters can turn out lights and turn off water. But monsters cannot find me because I believe in magical things. Elves, fairies, wizards, and sprites. And for magical things, there is always more than war. Beware monsters in the woods. My imagination was not lost in the rubble of my school. I see you. So quite an interesting young woman. I wish her the best. I don't know anything else about her, except the poem she inspired. I wanted to end with this slide because these are kids, refugee kids from Moldova, and as you can imagine, kids are, wherever you go, whatever the situation, even the rubble of a school or the rubble of a hospital, eventually they're going to just go back to play. And these kids inspired me on my first visit. So I'll stop there and take questions. And happy to talk about anything related to the refugees, IDPs, that sort of thing. So.
Thank you, Chip. That was very moving, and I know that we're all a little emotional, perhaps. Chip mentioned that this is the first part of the presentation, so I just wanted to say is that we're going to take some Q&A with Chip directly right now, and then Jerry Stepaniak, who's the chair of our World Community Service Committee and has been involved with some of the efforts that our club has been involved with in Ukraine, is going to come up and they're going to have a short conversation. But we wanted to first do Q&A with Chip. So, if you have a question for Chip, this is your opportunity. You want to come up here?
Thank you, Chip. Very heartwarming presentation. Did you see any evidence of the United Nations working in the areas that you were allowed to go into?
In all three trips, the answer would be no. I don't need to give such a short answer, but no, we didn't. We did see quite a bit of support from the EU in the refugee centers, and the EU was providing a stipend at the time for refugees that would help offset the cost of food and that sort of thing. A side note on that, in Moldova versus the other countries, Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, etc. In Moldova, of the roughly 80,000 refugees, the vast majority were living in private homes. And so the burden of food and everything was falling on those families. That's one of the reasons the subsidies were so important.
Hi, just a quick question. When you say about your title, A Different War, can you elaborate a little bit more? What makes it different?
Well, yes. I mean, I do elaborate in the book by talking about the places that I've personally photographed and documented. In Afghanistan, for example, in many ways, people tried to make it a proxy war for superpowers, but for the most part, it was really more like a civil war. So if you follow the Afghan track back into the 90s, they've been fighting, at the time, Northern Alliance versus the Taliban, but it was largely a civil war. It's also, I spell this out in the book in terms of the geography, but a country like Afghanistan is landlocked, and a whole different set of problems occurred there than a country like Ukraine that has a coast and a river border and things like that allow for more trade. That's just one example. It's also, in my case, been that most of the wars that I've documented have had an ethnic component, and this one, in large part, there are scholars certainly who would be able to elaborate more than me, but in large part, Ukrainians and Russians have a very long shared history, and so you're not able to necessarily delineate by faith or ethnicity the same way you would in Ethiopia or Sudan or some of the other places I've documented.
Jeff, thanks for being here. Please come back again with a happy story sometime. Did you see any evidence, with the billions of dollars that have been sent over there, did you see any evidence of misappropriation of funds?
Actually, that's a great question. I saw exactly the opposite of misappropriation. Everywhere we went, every facility that we dealt with, hospitals, rehabilitation centers, the Paralympic Center, they were all going out of their way to document every penny of aid that they were receiving to try and make sure that there was no issue around misappropriation of funds. So it was even that is different than in other places. I saw a lot of misappropriation in Afghanistan and a lot in Ethiopia, and a lot of black market activity in Sudan and Ethiopia. But in this case, I would say very much the opposite, that a great deal of responsible accounting is going on.
I
I'm just curious about how you told people where you were from or what questions they asked. Like if you said, "Hi, I'm Chip, I'm from America," or "Hi, I'm Chip, I'm from Milwaukee," or "Hey, I'm Chip, I'm from near Chicago," you know, that place with a large Ukrainian population. I mean, and how people responded to that, like, are they aware of, and what was their attitude about America? Oh, America, that place, blah. What was, when you told people where you were from?
Thank you for that question. I've been, for better or worse, been doing this for about 40 years now, and I almost always, I'm sorry to say, use the locator of Chicago because it's more internationally well known. And then if they know where Chicago is, then I get more, if I have time, I get a little more detailed. Oh, it's just about 100 kilometers north of Chicago. I actually live in Milwaukee. But Chicago is a great identifier. The reception for Americans has been phenomenal. And again, it's a different war in that sense. I'm welcomed. I'm wanted. My presence there is invited. And so the easiest way I can describe it is getting across the border from Poland into Ukraine. We've discovered that the easiest way for our team is to drive to the border, walk across the border, get another car in Ukraine, and then continue on. And it takes about 10 minutes to cross the border. The minute they know you're from the US, they're excited that you're there, happy. Now, I will say, I have not been there, I'm going back very, very soon, but I haven't been there in the last few months, and I know that a lot has, their citizens are on pins and needles about our election, just like most people in the US are, because they know the consequences of this election have an impact on what happens to them. And so, in a general sense, I would say they want our help, and they want us to come back, but it's also, there's a little more sadness and wariness today, at least in my Zoom calls, than there was a year ago.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the 200,000 children? Why were 20,000 returned in some fashion? And are the Russians expected to be good record keepers with a paper trail for the other 180,000, or are they just going to disappear?
Well, I'm definitely not an expert, but I would say that the New York Times has done some of the best reporting I've seen on the children who have been either abducted or in some way repatriated. And you know, sometimes it's not always you know, a hideous thing. There are cases where, you know, if they're finding young people who have been, you know, injured in an attack and there's no one else to take care of them, there are cases where they're providing the emergency medical services. But that is not the story that most people will tell. It's really a case of trying to take the young people and repatriate them and turn them into Russian citizens. Which is the kind of thing, if you're thinking, if you imagine a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old, 7-year-old is much easier than a 17 or 18-year-old to do. There are ways that the families in Ukraine are petitioning the Russian government to get their children back. And there is a judicial process. And somebody else asked about the UN. The UN is playing a role in that. And it's possible, but so far, of the 200,000, only about 10% of those kids have been returned. And in most cases, the Ukrainian families do not know where their children are. They don't even know who to petition.
So Chip, what do you expect to focus on when you go back to Ukraine?
So I've been invited by Doug Davis and others to participate in documenting MedShare, which is a large NGO based out of Chicago, working primarily in Syria and in Ukraine. They're one of the most successful NGOs working in Ukraine right now. And then it looks like each time I've gone with a philanthropist named Dan White, who has turned out to be a godsend. And Dan and I, when we first went to Venezia, for example, we focused all of our fundraising energy on the rehabilitation center called Open Hearts. And these seem like small things at first, but they added a second story because there were so many people that needed housing, but they didn't have an elevator to get to the second floor, which for people who are disabled is a big deal. So we raised money for the elevator. Then they were transporting people who were injured from Venezia to the west in a van with people just lying on the floor of the van. So we raised money and purchased a wheelchair accessible van. Now the next focus is, a recent focus is on the Paralympic Center, and then after that it will be trying to make the film about Liza.
And then you mentioned this is the second part of a trilogy. What will the third part be?
I can't remember who asked about coming with a happy story, but well, there you are. But I promise if you invite me back when the third book in the trilogy is done, it's about the Sacred Valley in Peru and Machu Picchu. And years ago I spoke there about Machu Picchu.
Right.
I hate to tell you how many times I've been there.
All right, well, we'll look forward to having that program when the time is right. Okay, so Jerry, you're going to come.
Just going to check this way.
Testing.
Just borrow it for 1 second. That's good. Everything else. So one of the things I saved till the end here is the fact that everywhere I go in Ukraine, Rotary is a big thumbs up from the Ukrainian people. And in particular, in the city of Lviv, I've been now several times to the warehouse in Lviv that is stockpiling a lot of the medical supplies and other things that have come from the Rotaries, and especially Milwaukee Rotary and other Rotaries. So, Jerry, if you can just give us a little bit of background on what this Rotary Club did right after the invasion.
Thank you, Chip. And that was a fabulous presentation, absolutely fabulous. What we all recall, I think, when the invasion happened, I looked it up this morning, it was February 24th of 2022. Probably all of you are like me, we kind of got depressed, trying to figure out what the heck is happening, and then slowly, well, what can we do to help the situation? And about a month after the invasion, I got a call from a colleague in Madison, a Rotary colleague, who said, Jerry, you ought to call this guy that I met the other day. His name is Doug Davis. He's sitting right over here, and he's now a Rotary Club of Milwaukee member. Call Dick Davis. He's married to a Ukrainian doctor, and he's a doctor, and you guys ought to talk because I understand that, you know, your club sometimes does some things international. So I literally called up, cold call, and said, Doug, this is Jerry Stepaniak. Tell me about what's happening. And I won't go into all of the blow-by-blow detail, but when we had that call on a Wednesday, Doug told me about the need for medical supplies because there was an acute shortage everywhere, especially on the front lines of medical supplies, and that he was involved in an effort with a group called UMANA, the Ukrainian Medical Association of North America, and other groups, and they were starting to collect medical supplies, but they had to be processed and packaged and shipped. And he said, can you help? I said, I think we can. So I talked with Mary and a small group of people, some of whom are here. Teresa, Joanne, Pat, Dr. Bob, Kate Shortall. We basically said, let's just figure out how we're going to do this. By that time, Doug had already identified a warehouse owned by a Ukrainian guy, actually not owned, leased by a Ukrainian guy in Germantown. So on Friday, we met at the warehouse, and 9 days later, the warehouse, A, was filled with all kinds of medical stuff. Some of it sorted, some of it not sorted. And we had put a word out to this club, and like 150 people, and wives and kids and whatever from this club showed up. and docs from the medical college, and Tiffany Fraser is here right in front. She was helping to organize that effort at the medical college. Docs from the UW hospital showed up. And actually, I know a lot of you were there. So could people just stand that were a part of this effort of sorting all these medical goods? So we ended up doing that session. We ended up doing 5 more sessions. Medical goods were continuing to come in. As we processed them, we had, people remember, we had these tarps on the floor, and this was rehab, and this was operating room, and that was prosthetics, and so forth. It got packaged, it got labeled, bills of lading were put together. The company who leased the warehouse, this Ukrainian individual, has 200 trucks. He got everything shipped to Chicago. Early parts of the war, we actually got free shipping by several of the major international shipping companies whose names you would recognize, and something like 2 or 3 cargo plane loads of stuff went out of here. We did 100 tons of medical supplies out of this club and out of that warehouse. And what was amazing, and Chip had mentioned sort of the documentation, I was wondering about that too. It's like, okay, it's pretty well organized here, but what happens after it gets on the plane and it gets over there? So when the plane lands in Poland, not Ukraine, and then it gets shipped over to a warehouse very quietly, not labeled so the Russians don't know where it is. We have pictures and we have video information and we have data printouts of where every single pallet has gone. And we numbered the pallets with label, and we can actually have film evidence of that arriving at a warehouse. And from there, it ends up getting shipped to the front lines, getting shipped to the hospitals elsewhere where some of the wounded are being taken, and even to some of the subways and shelters that Chip mentioned. One of the things that I gained some appreciation for is how the networking that gets put in place really makes this magic happen. It's not just our club. It is dealing with Humana. It is dealing with people like, Doug and Tiffany in terms of holding in the medical community. It's getting to the hospitals to donate. There's an organization called Be an Angel, which I think many of us know, Anya Vergaskaya, who basically runs that, the United States portion of that. All of this stuff gets put together, and somehow an idea from a phone call ends up with 100 tons of stuff going out of there. But it's not just 100 tons. I just discovered this more recently. Apparently what was happening that was unknown to me, and I think unknown to a lot of us, is the description of what was happening here was being used to talk to other donating entities, to drug companies, to medical supply companies, to large medical systems, and basically saying, we can sort this stuff, and we have a method of making sure that it's not going to get lost or stolen. And so I'm told like 500 tons of materials were actually provided, and that includes drugs and Band-Aids and prosthetics and all kinds of stuff. But because of our efforts to help organize this in some rational fashion, it really had sort of this very positive unknown effect. So, thank you for everyone who has contributed to this, because it's really a very nice major deal.
I think we should just go to the last question.
All right, we will go to the last question. Just so you know, the one we're skipping is about generators, and we can both talk about generators afterwards. But the last question is very specific to the medical services that you're providing now for severely injured children. So take it away.
More recently, this is about in the last 6 months, and I think you may have seen some of our efforts to recruit some assistance. Anya and her folks with the Friends of Being an Angel have been talking with and evacuating a number of small children. They're kids under the age of 2. They have been diagnosed with something called spinal muscular atrophy, SMA. And essentially they have a gene mutation and without some intervention, their muscles are just going to atrophy and they're going to probably die very, very early. There is not, during this war situation, any way of treating them in Ukraine. And so the effort is, can we bring not only the child, but obviously the parents connected with the child here and see if we can arrange that. Some incredible work is being done with Children's Hospital of Wisconsin that is providing the services, a group of doctors that are becoming reasonably expert in this particular affliction. An incredible negotiation. There is a drug that has been identified that specifically targets this particular mutation. The problem is the cost of one injection, and one injection is all that's needed. One injection is a 7-figure number. I mean, I heard numbers like $2.5 million for an injection, which is absolutely crazy, right? But the companies I've been negotiated with, the families are becoming eligible for a variety of programs, and we have 7 families that have been brought here. I have personally been involved with 3 of them, and our task is not to do anything on the medical side, but to do everything else. These families are basically showing up with 2 suitcases, and they're scared to death. So we need to find an apartment for them, and figure out who's going to pay for the apartment. We need beds, we need couches, we need pots and pans. We need to give them some food in the refrigerator. And then we need to figure out how to get them transported back and forth to the hospital, and all of those kinds of daily logistical kinds of things. So we are in the midst of doing that. For those of you who might be interested in helping, whether that's doing some volunteer stuff, whether that's seeking donations of all of your friends for the furniture they're no longer using, or the pots and pans that they don't need from the cottage they just closed up, or whatever the case may be. We could use all of that. We could also use a check or 2 if you're so inclined, because right now there is no funding source for the apartments, and it's being done privately. So that's a very cool effort. The kids that have the injection are all doing well. We are looking for places that are within like a mile radius of Children's Hospital, so that's West Dallas, Wauwatosa, maybe west side of Milwaukee. We've been able to find some places. But a great effort, and it literally is life-changing for that family.